Hello and welcome to the Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, coming to you from MVTV, community television here on Martha's Vineyard Island. Bonnie Stacy is here today, and she is the Chief Curator at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. Now, the museum is an exciting place. I don't know if you've been recently. I don't know if you've been at all. And the museum is going to be moving, as we know, from the Cookhouse in Edgartown to the Marine Hospital in Vineyard Haven. This is an exciting time for the museum, and Bonnie's going to talk to us about the collection, some of her favorite things in the collection, about exhibits, about shows that are going on, and about the transition to Vineyard Haven. So, thank you, Bonnie, for being here.
Thank you.
I'm very curious about your job and what you do and how you see the museum. So start right off and tell us a little bit about you and how did you get here? How did you choose Martha's Vineyard?
Okay, well, you know what, that's kind of an interesting story because I was living in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I was the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at Historic Bethlehem Partnership in Bethlehem, and that was a group that had a number of historic sites and museums. And so I was doing, I was the only curator on staff, and it seemed to me at a certain point that I thought maybe I wanted to change. My family's from New England, Plymouth, as a matter of fact, and so I had been looking, and when I saw the ad for the job at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, I thought, well, you know what, this is quite an interesting possibility. So I followed up on that, and here I am. That was 7 years ago.
7 years ago.
Yes.
And so you've settled right in, into the community.
Yeah, I love it.
And you've just moved.
Yes, well, I'm actually in between. I'm out of my old place and I'm into my new place in a couple of weeks. And so I'm in my staying with friends period, which is nice to have friends who will allow you to do that. And
yes.
So that's kind of, I'm in between Edgartown and Oak Bluffs right now. And that's West Tisbury, which geographically is not in between, but it is for me right now.
I hear you. I hear you. Now, tell us a little bit about your job and how your day is structured and what you're in charge of and other staff.
The job is Chief Curator. I oversee a staff of 2 curators and research librarian. There is our Curator of Oral History, Lindsay Lee, and our Curator of Exhibitions, Anna Barber. And Bo Van Riper is our research librarian. And there is an assistant to the Oral History Curator who just started. Her name is Laura Noonan, and we're very happy to have her on board. And this summer we'll be getting an intern, and so it's very exciting to have so many people working on the mission of the museum. And you asked what I do, and I see the curatorial department as the core department where we do the mission of the museum, that is telling the stories of Martha's Vineyard in one way or another. So Lindsay will do the oral history. She collects oral histories, and then we integrate them into exhibitions. Anna is the one who, from sort of soup to nuts, does research and gets the exhibitions installed and everything in between. Bo helps us out as we dive into the archives and find the things that really illustrate the stories that we're trying to tell. And so among us, we kind of pull it all together. I am not only in charge of the department, but I'm a primary responsibility over the collections. That is the objects and the archives. And of course, the oral histories are part of the collections as well. And Lindsay's the one who has sort of the charge over those. It's kind of a all over the place sort of job.
Yes, yes it is. And let's talk about some of the objects and about keeping them safe, because you have to have certain temperatures for certain and certain lack of humidity for some things.
Absolutely.
And so how are you working on those things? Challenges?
Yes, well, you know, that's one of the main reasons that we need to move, is because our current facilities don't allow us to keep control over the temperature and relative humidity in the way that's best for the collections. And each type of collection has its own requirements. So, for example, the archives need to be at a certain temperature relative humidity. They like to be cold. We always have that area chillier than other areas. We have different requirements for the different things and different places in the museum where things are stored to the best of our ability in their proper circumstances. Now, when we move, we will be able to regulate the temperature and the relative humidity much more precisely, and it will allow us not only to store the things in the best way possible, but also it will allow us to borrow things from other museums who have strict standards about what they will, conditions they'll allow their objects to be in. So we're really hoping that once we're moved, we can supplement our collection through loans. So if somebody has a Thomas Hart Benton painting, for example, that would be a perfect illustration for one of our exhibitions, we can ask to borrow it and have a better chance of having it loaned to us.
My. Lots of challenges. Talk a little bit about the move, because where you are now in the Thomas Cook House and in the other house, which is called?
The Pease House.
The Pease House, thank you very much. Oh, really? Related to the Pease family?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. We'll talk genealogy before we're through, which would be great. And most of the exhibits, the current exhibits, are in the Pease House.
Yes.
I'm just so curious. First of all, tell us a little bit about what's on exhibit right now.
Okay. So right now, we have our permanent exhibit, which is the history of Martha's Vineyard. We have an exhibit on shipwrecks, which just went up, and that is a perennial favorite topic because there are so many around here, and we have quite a few interesting things in the collection that illustrate that topic. Things from the city of Columbus. We have a life preserver from the city of Columbus that is on exhibit right now. We have the quarter board for the city of Columbus, which is actually too big to fit in the Pease House. So that's in the carriage shed, which is another building on the grounds. It's the one with the big whale on the front of it. That's where we keep our boats and that sort of thing. Another exhibit that's up right now and will be up until sometime in June is the Lost and Found exhibit, which is a fun exhibit that shows old historical photographs and then from the same angle what the place looks like right now. And we have found that locals, especially people from Martha's Vineyard, and people who've lived here a long time particularly enjoy this exhibition because they recognize everything. It has oral histories in it of people talking about the different places, and then of course the photographs, which are very self-explanatory, and I think that's one of the reasons that it appeals to so many people.
I have to say that I had not physically been at the museum for a couple of years until the Sandy Fisher exhibit.
Oh, yes.
Now that just absolutely triggered my enthusiasm because, first of all, knowing Sandy and having interviewed Sandy and being friends with his daughter Madeline, the exhibit was, I thought, very, very well done. And Sally Pierce, who had worked for you as a special curator, yes?
Yes, so she guest curated that exhibit, but she had also cataloged our works on paper.
That's right.
Yes.
Her specialty is paper. And she had worked at the Athenaeum and has great credentials.
That's true.
There were paintings, there were drawings, some of which were very, very familiar. It was a time when Mary Coles was producing work, and the Rosés there were gorgeous paintings. There was an anvil, there were some fishing implements, there was a scallop drag. I mean, it was a down-home exhibit.
Yes, yes.
And Sally said that she was inspired to do this because she had been going ahead and working in the collection and was told, if you see anything that looks like an exhibit, you could pull it together. She had read Tom Dunlop's obit of Sandy Fisher.
Yes.
And she said that's what inspired her.
Yeah.
Talks about the coal wharf, talks about... What a great exhibit that was.
It was such fun, and it was really wonderful because Madeline also was very key in helping with that. And so she and Sally worked together, and we were so pleased with the way that came out. And it was so well received. It's actually what we're going for. We are hoping in our changing exhibits to show that we have these wonderful things that maybe you don't see very often. Works on paper have to stay in the dark most of the time, so they're not out all that often. and they'd never been pulled together in just this way. And there are so many people who loved Sandy Fisher that it was like a wonderful coming together of the community that in the museum with relevant objects and works of art and family. And we really felt wonderful to be able to make that happen. And it's the kind of exhibition that we want to keep doing. So every once in a while, something will pop into our heads, or a member of the community will approach us. We did an exhibition for the Scottish Society recently.
Yes.
We did an exhibition of the cottagers. We did an exhibition of the polar bears. And this is one of the things that we are really hoping and planning to continue in our new site, because it's just a way for the community to make this museum their own. And that's the way we see ourselves, and what we need is for the community to see us that way.
Oh, I love that, because we are a community of communities. How wonderful to see that you're able to do that kind of focus within the broader sense of the community of Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, it's great. And we do associated programming, lectures, and sometimes classes. And so it's great when people will come and they'll do a lecture, and the whole constituency will turn out, and the audience will be full, and everybody is just super into the subject, and it's so much fun. Currently, we have a relatively small space for those lectures, and that's another thing that we're improving in our new site, to the point where the space is so small that I really want to hear the talk, but because I work for the museum, I essentially have to go away so that there's a room for another body, for a person to come in and watch and listen to the talk. And so this is sort of a testament to the popularity of some of these topics, the enthusiasm of the community, and our need to have a bigger space.
Right. Well said. Well, and I also want to thank you for your generosity in allowing me to come in and do some filming while the Sandy Fisher exhibit was up. My brother Todd, who's the co-captain of Magic Carpet in Edgartown, and Floyd, wonderful old timer, did a talk about Edgartown Harbor, the way they both remembered, two different generations, but the way they both worked on the harbor and still do today. And Nelson Smith, got to interview Nelson 3 months ago. You allowed me to come in, and it inspired some of his memories, which is what we were looking for.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. And that's the other thing. Sometimes people will have an idea, and it'll be like, well, you know, it would be a great thing to do this interview right here in the museum. And we are thrilled when people come to us with ideas. And we are so happy when people will see one of our exhibitions and they'll say, hey, you know what? I thought that these papers, you know, they might not have been anything but just old, you know, something to burn in the fireplace, but there might be something in there that the museum might be interested, that future generations might find interesting. This happens quite a bit. We just had a donation to the museum by the family of Doris Huff, and it's a wonderful collection of photographs and textiles and some papers, and of course she was instrumental in the Girl Scouts, and so we were so thrilled to get them, and we haven't processed it yet. This is a brand new donation. But it was somebody who was looking at the house and saying, well, you know what, we need to thin down our personal collection a little bit, and saw the museum as a possible place where some of these things could find a new home. And we are so happy the photographs are identified, which means that people who are coming to do research will know who they're looking at. They're really wonderful pictures and documents and clothing, textiles, things like that.
Well, I know that one of your challenges is that when you're looking at a collection of things, it will be in a box and it will say donated by, and that's it. There's no identification. So there are photographs of people in there, there are paintings of houses in there, and you have no idea. What a challenge that is.
Yes, and well, that's when we bring in people like you who can maybe help us identify places, tell us something about the artists, tell us something about perhaps the people who donated it. Recently, we are trying to be super careful about making sure that we have all of our records straight. And in the past, people were also, very attentive to that, but I think that they didn't realize sometimes when they were writing things down that people weren't always going to remember what a place was, or who the people were.
Or what the context was.
Or what the context was. So they might say, this is the old Daggett house. Give me a town, give me a street, tell me, who built, I need to know. Obviously there will be people who do know, but I came here from away, so sometimes I'll be like, and I need information, so I'm always writing down tedious detail about things with the idea that, my counterpart in 40 years will thank me for it.
Yes, that's a big job, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, that collection management is a major part of my job, and it's really kind of fun. It sounds sort of tedious, collection management, but it's actually working with the stuff. And I'm always going through the database, and it's like, what is this? This looks fascinating. And I can go look at it and find it and say, oh, this is a really interesting thing. This has a whole story to tell. And each object has multiple stories to tell. Who made it? Who used it? When was it used? It's a part of a bigger story. When we look at the things from the Port Hunter, for example, there's the World War I story, there's the shipwreck story, there's the Martha's Vineyard people making use out of these perfectly good things on the ship, the candles and the leather vests and
the long underwear.
The long underwear.
When I was growing up, my mother would tell about stories about everybody on the line, especially in July. Some people only took off their long underwear in July. You'd see on all the clotheslines in Edgartown, flapping in the breeze, long underwear. And she still had some Port Hunter candles. And you're right, there were a lot of things. And I was talking recently with Jim Osmondson, who's a diver. And he every year goes and dives in the Port Hunter and takes photographs. It's a story that keeps going.
It certainly is. And we have, in the exhibit that's up right now, we have some of those things, and there is some actual film footage of divers around the wreck. And so it's really an interesting, different perspective on the whole story.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to hear about the Shipwreck exhibition that's on right now. I'm going to have to make a point to come and see it, and maybe you'll let me film it, because those are the stories we grew up with here on the island. And, and we know the descendants of the people who were involved in saving people. It's really thrilling that history is not static. History keeps going. As you say, the stories keep going.
They do. They do. And the different stories have relevance at different times. I think that, like when we were children, there were, there was the Revolutionary War and the great men and all of this. Now, and especially at a more local museum, the stories tend to focus on everyday people, or people who maybe wouldn't show up in a regular history book, but they have a wonderful story. The Wampanoags at the rescue station in Gale, who went out in the frigid high waves to rescue people that were on the city of Columbus in 1884. These people were hanging on to the rigging. It was January, it was freezing cold. This wreck happened at night, and this was before there were lights that people could see distress. There wasn't radio. And so it wasn't until first dawn that the lighthouse keeper could see that there was a wreck. And that's when the men at the rescue station got the boat out and went out in the high waves to help with this rescue, risking their lives. And it was a very tragic wreck. I mean, more than 100 people died, but there was heroism as well. And it was the heroism of everyday people. You know, these were fishermen or people who had, you know, a day job. They made this great sacrifice to save whoever they could.
Exactly. And of course in Edgartown it was the wreck of the Mattie B. Crowley. That is the big story, and Herb Ward tells it very, very well, and has wonderful pictures and diagrams, and identifies all of the sailors at the time and their descendants here today when he talks about it. And I was up in the biplane last September and flying over East Beach and saw below the waves what's left of the Mattie B. Crowley.
Oh, yes.
You're right. It's all still relevant today. And these stories of heroism shouldn't be forgotten.
That's absolutely true. And so that's, you know, and that's just one tiny little aspect of the sorts of stories that we're able to tell. I mean, I think that most of the people who've been paying attention to the museum are familiar with the Laura Jernigan story, the girl on the whale ship, the little child who was keeping a diary, and, you know, so that's a child story. There are women's stories, just the, you know, things that about the everyday labor that women had to do, perhaps in the cookhouse. Then there are, you know, women who were pioneering physicians, and that kind of thing. So many different aspects, and sometimes people come to us with these stories and say, let's see if we can pull together an exhibit about this. Sometimes an object will spark a story, and so that's kind of, it comes from all different sources.
Right. So tell us some of your favorite objects. I have a lot of them, but tell us some of yours.
Okay, so last year, or maybe it was the year before, it all blurs together, we did a book called Island Stories.
Yes.
And it had 50 of our prize things, and I was part of selecting them, so some of my favorite objects made it into that book. And they would be things like Gale Huntington's Fiddle.
Oh, yes.
That is such a wonderful and broad-ranging story. It's the musical story, it's the history. He was a collector of songs.
Sea shanties.
And, yes, just sort of folklorist. And we not only have musical instruments, we have a guitar of his as well, but we have writings of his. That kind of pulls so many things together. It also shows about the different facets of a Martha's Vineyard person. And this is something I hit over and over again. People on the vineyard so often don't do just one thing.
We wear many hats.
It's true. And so you will find throughout history people who are whalers, but they're also farmers, and they're also fishermen. And they might be lawyers, and they might be have different things in different parts of their lives, or even a lot of things at the same time that they do. You know, that kind of carries you along to Thomas Hart Benton, because they knew each other and they'd made music together. And
there's that wonderful painting.
There's that wonderful painting. And we have a couple of Bentons in the collection, which are among my favorite objects. And they are not only by this wonderful artist, but each of them tells a different story. One of them, it's hanging in my office, is a painting of Zeb Tilton.
Yes. Yes.
And that is just such a wonderful coastal schooner, all sorts of wonderful aspects to that story. And the other one is in our gallery, our permanent exhibition, and that's of Josie West, who was a member of the Chilmark Deaf community. And that is a story that people travel to Martha's Vineyard to learn about.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many people come in who are deaf who want to see things relating to that story. And so we are able to provide them with that in the exhibition, and we are continuing to work on trying to create more materials because it is such a popular story. It's unique to Martha's Vineyard and very important to deaf people over the world. So
Yes.
so those two paintings are some of my favorites. The tombstones of Nancy Lucis hens.
That's right.
I love
What
them.
treasures. Yes.
And the poetry on them, and the names of her hens. You know, those are in our gallery as well. And she was such an interesting character, an unhappy woman, but resourceful, able to turn her poverty and the fact that she was an eccentric, a curiosity almost. People would come to the fair, the ag fair, and they would make a side trip to look at the chicken lady and taunt her sometimes in very cruel ways.
Right. Oh, she wrote about the young men from Edgartown who would come at night and rattle her windows and call her names, and it just makes your heart bleed.
Yes, it was terrible. They were terrible to her. But she also had photographs of herself professionally taken, and she would sell them to people who came to visit her. And she had little pamphlets made up of her poetry and remedies for things that might go wrong with your chickens.
Right.
What's the best way to feed them? And so you on the one hand, you have this woman who was clearly unhealthy and unhappy, and on the other hand, you have this story of resilience and ability to make the best out of a bad situation.
Right,
So,
which she did.
she
Which she
did.
did. Well, I have to comment on everything you just said, because Gale Huntington was my favorite teacher, and I studied Latin with him for 3 years in the Edgartown School. He was a brilliant, brilliant man, very understated, but he wrote books, he collected music, as you say. He was very much a Renaissance man. And how lucky we were to have him. And I love listening to the stories about Nancy Luce. And as you say, her eccentricity, and heaven knows the island is always full of eccentrics in every generation.
Mm-hmm.
I always knew as a child that I would always be welcome here. It's just a statement of fact. She, in essence, made it pay off.
Yeah.
She was a survivor. She was resilient. She kept on being herself. She didn't conform to anything else. I love that.
Yes.
Absolutely love that. Those are terrific. And I would also suggest that people come to the museum now. Yes, it's going to move. Yes, it's going to be bigger and better. Come now and see what's there. Check out the exhibits, the permanent exhibits and the changing exhibits. And look at the gift shop. There are some wonderful books, some fabulous things in there. If you're buying things to send to relatives off island that have to have a real vineyard connection, think of shopping at the gift shop, yes?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to mention, the cookhouse is still going to stay in Edgartown, and it's going to be part of the museum.
Yes.
And so we will have an Edgartown presence. I love Edgartown. It's such a beautiful place. There are some traffic issues occasionally, but it is a lovely place, and the cookhouse is a rarity and becoming rarer. It has maintained a lot of its integrity. It's on the same site that it was built. It has never been plumbed. There's no plumbing. It is not insulated. It's why we don't have exhibits there in the winter. It's only open seasonally.
Yeah.
Barely has electricity. And so it's one of those places that has so much atmosphere when you walk into it. At the beginning of the year, every year at the beginning of the season, we go in, clean it up, we get it ready for the public. And once we finish sort of doing the cleaning and the polishing and the looking across, it's just a lovely atmosphere in that building. And so it will remain part of the museum, and it will remain open to the public, and we're trying to figure out now the best thing to do with it, the best way for people to enjoy the house. And it's such a wonderful historical place. And so that's one of the things that we're hoping to do, and that's actually something that that I want people to know is we aren't sort of dictating from on high the stories that will be told or the way things are necessarily going to be used. We want to respond to what the community wants from its museum. And so, we've been thinking, well, what do people want from the cookhouse? And we're listening, and we will be asking And I hope people will pay attention to media so that when we do put out our call for, ideas, that they'll be able to respond and tell us, what they want. And I would encourage people, even before they do that, or if they don't want to do that, to kind of come in and experience the place this summer so that they can sort of get a feel for the way it is. Think of things that maybe would make it better.
Right. Well, I want you to do an exhibit on the way it was. When the Thomas Cook House was built, there was nothing between it and the harbor. And Thomas Cook, who was the customs official, as you know, was able to literally see ships coming in and would know that he would have to meet them so that they could go through the proper paperwork. And that is a fascinating concept, because now the Thomas Cook House looks buried in the back of a lot. And that would make a great exhibit, what it looked like. Now, Mary Jane Carpenter, in one of her 12 shows on Edgartown history, talks about the Cook House and about Thomas Cook himself and his family. And you're right. I'm so glad it's going to be staying as part of the museum in Edgartown. I know you're going to take the lighthouse lens. I know you're going to take the library, but I'm glad you're leaving the Thomas Cook House.
It's only 7 miles away, the things that we're taking.
I know. We are xenophobic. I'm sorry. We are.
Well, anyway, so it's a wonderful place, and it's on a wonderful site, and so we're glad that it's going to stay. So.
Great. And I know that Phil has vision. He has the vision thing. And he's talking about openness and gardens and picnic areas and welcoming the public in. So we're all excited to see how this is all going to evolve.
Yes, and so are we.
Yes, right, exactly.
Keeping track of things, as it seems kind of boring, but you want to be able to know where everything is all the time. And several years ago, we had some people come in, museum professionals from a firm called MCR, who did a wall-to-wall inventory of everything we have. It all got put into a database. And now we can just be like, where's this? And poof, there it is. Its location, its box number, all of that. I can hardly convey to you how exciting this is to people like me. And it will make it really wonderful when we move, because we'll be able to sort of automatically say this box is going in this place and all that. So there's that. Growing the collection is part of what I do. And that is something that I am really looking forward to when we move and we try to expand our exhibition program. There are whole areas of Martha's Vineyard history that are not well represented in the collection. When the museum first started back in the 1920s, history was considered, the colonial history, whaling era history. People were not as interested in things that were closer in time to them. Of course, some of the things that we consider history hadn't even happened yet in the 1920s. And so I think that one of the things that happens is that people don't think about their own time as being important. And so one of the things we're trying to do is like, what's happening now that maybe people in 50 years will want to know about? What should we collect? That is dangerous because we can't collect everything. We don't have room for everything. So, but I really wish that in the 1970s, somebody from the museum said, you know what we need? Some stuff from that movie they just made here. Well, Jaws. Wouldn't that be great? Nobody said that.
Right,
and
that's right.
So now we're trying to fill in some of the blanks. I mean, I think that people know about the African American community and its history here on Martha's Vineyard, and particularly in Oak Bluffs. We are just now trying to fill in some of the blanks in our collection having to do with that story. We have a typewriter that was owned by Helene Johnson and used by her and Dorothy West, her cousin. Things like that really resonate with people, and we are still trying to identify the collections that maybe should come to the museum. Everybody knows about the wonderful African American History Museum in Washington that just opened up at the Smithsonian. they have things from Martha's Vineyard that we really would love to have similar things for our collection, so that people could come to our museum on Martha's Vineyard, right near where these things were actually used, and see them and learn about the people who used them. And so that's the kind of collecting that we are hoping to do into the future. Fill in some of the blanks. Of course, we love scrimshaw.
Oh, yes.
It's beautiful. But we have a lot of scrimshaw.
Yes, I bet.
And so while I wouldn't say no to it, because it's beautiful and I love it, it's not what we're going after right now.
Right, that's interesting. Well, yes, because last year you did an exhibit on the 1960s.
Yes.
And I was a hippie here in the 60s, and Lindsay came and interviewed me, and some of the memorabilia that I have.
Yes.
Because I was doing clothing design at the time. Those were right there in the museum.
Yes,
So it's not just colonial history, is it?
Absolutely. And very often at the end of these exhibitions, people will actually donate some of the things that we had borrowed, and they'll say, you know what, I'd like the museum to have these. And we love that. So
yes. And people should think about that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Look at your camera and tell people that they should remember the museum.
Remember the museum. If you have things that you think are important to the history of Martha's Vineyard, there's a very good chance that the museum will agree with you. And I'm the person to talk to. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. I think that we're in a really exciting position right now, where we are continuing to work in Edgartown. We've got our exhibits here. We're moving along on that, and then we're looking to the future. We're planning new exhibits for our new facility in Vineyard Haven. There's so much going on. We're hoping to show more of the collection, and that's sort of where the Island Stories book with the 50 objects comes in. That's the tip of the iceberg book.
Right.
And so it's like, if you think these things are interesting, wait till you see what we've got coming, because there's so much of it. The archives I barely talked about. There are thousands and thousands of documents. Each one of them has a different story that it tells. Thousands of photographs, thousands of postcards, really wonderful, wonderful things. I remember when I was working on the Civil War exhibit shortly after I started, I was reading the Vineyard Gazettes with a magnifying glass because the type is so tiny. And I was just reading all of the Civil War era Vineyard Gazettes. There's so much information.
Wow.
You learn so much just by reading what the people who were alive then were reading. And I would find information that would take me to something else in the museum or in the museum's collection. Something about the Monahans. We've got a painting of the Monahans. She was built during the Civil War, brought to the vineyard, and then commandeered, or I don't know that that's the proper term, but General Grant was using her down during the war. And so it was one of those things that was being, where's our ferry, and it's such a great story. And so I guess that's the sort of thing that I'm hoping people will realize, is that, we're the museum for the entire island. We are the museum for all of our stories. I didn't even talk about the natural history. We have fossils. We have a megalodon tooth that's huge. There's so much there, and our job is to share it. It's not to hoard it. And so we're hoping for help from the community, advice on how we should share it. We are hoping that when we move to our new facility, our enthusiasm for what we're doing will spill over, and everybody will be as excited as we are about the whole new place and the old place in Edgartown.
I love it that you use the word sharing, because it is all about sharing. And I just want to add that you are open and you are welcoming to the community. And that wasn't always true. I have to say that. That was not always true. I'm thrilled that there are 4 of us in Edgartown, myself, Mary Jane Carpenter, Marna Waller, and Madeline Fisher, who have formed an ad hoc committee that you have welcomed in terms of us coming in to help with recognizing older Edgartown paintings. I was there yesterday, as you know.
Yes.
I'm working with Anna, trying to identify, and we're going to do a walking tour so that we can match up certain paintings with certain houses. This is very exciting. Yeah. Every town should have an ad hoc committee, right?
Absolutely.
Because everybody has something to contribute, because this is our museum.
That's great. I couldn't have said it better.
Bonnie, thank you so much for being here today. And we're just beginning. We're just getting started. I'm going to interview Anna next, then I'm going to interview Bo, and Phil has said he will come in to be interviewed.
Yeah.
And I want to do all of this now, but I also want to do it while you're in transition, and then, of course, when you arrive there, and we'll be able to do a full program at the museum.
I'm so thrilled.
Right, well, so am I. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been The Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, saying keep your eye on MVTV. And please, check out the Martha's Vineyard Museum. You'll be thrilled and surprised, I think. And it's an ongoing story, so try to keep up.